General, thank you very much for giving us some of your precious time. I understand that the front is always shifting, and the situation changes very quickly. How would you describe it today, as of right now?
Right at this very moment, the situation's extremely tense,
Complicated.
but it is still under control. It's definitely not the absolute worst compared to other areas around here. It's currently under our broad strategic control, but the situation is exceptionally complex and constantly shifting given the current conditions. The ongoing offensive operation by the armed forces of the Russian Federation is actively unfolding right now along 13 main directions, with corresponding counteroffensive actions being taken in response. Actions by the armed forces of Ukraine.
How's it actually different from what people, Ukrainians, see on TV, in the media, and what you see? You see it differently, and the military sees it differently too, especially since you have the overall picture, the most complete one there is.
Of course, when I, let's say, imagine the situation, first a map appears in my mind, then a specific location. So yes, those of us in the military have a somewhat unique perspective. We instantly start to visualize a very specific geographic area. Considering that you know most of the front, and at different times you've been there, you could say you've been through it. So you understand what's happening there and how. Right now, the enemy is concentrating their main efforts. Just like before, in the Pokrovsk and Atrietten directions, in the Oleksandrivka direction, where today the greatest total number of offensive actions is currently being documented. There's also quite a lot of activity, and lately it's increased significantly in the area around Kostiantynivka. In this specific direction, the enemy is actively trying to break through. They are currently attacking our units from many different sides and from various directions. You know the exact specifics of the situation there, because Cheskova is steadily advancing in the Ochiertina direction, right within the defensive zone of the 19th Army Corps. Cheskova is advancing both from the east and from the northeast, within the primary defensive zone of the 11th Army Corps units. Army Corps. However, at this very moment, our brave soldiers are holding back the enemy there. A constant counter-sabotage operation is continuously being carried out in the city itself, and all attempts to break through or infiltrate the city are successfully neutralized and stopped by our units, either those on the very front lines of the conflict or those participating in the counter-sabotage operation.
Look, when we talk about the situation at the front, from my experience, how do people understand it? They understand it either by the enemy's losses or by some territorial gains. For example, the New York Times recently compared that in February, the Ukrainian army regained control over a larger percentage of territory than the Russians were able to capture. Does this kind of journalistic statistic reflect the reality on the battlefield? What information could you share?
You already know it's not. Hang in there. Starting back on January 29th, we successfully initiated a strategic offensive operation in the Oleksandrivka direction, with the primary goal of inflicting significant losses on the enemy, specifically targeting those units advancing on Huliaipol. And throughout the course of this entire period, as of today, we have successfully managed to liberate over 480 square kilometers of territory. And the offensive actions are ongoing.
This since January?
Right, since January 2020.
So basically during February and March.
Yes, during the months of February and March. At the same time, again, when we are considering our actions, and this has already been confirmed in practice, the enemy, of course, is responding to these actions. Our actions have led to the enemy once again being forced to change their plans. Beginning on the 1st of March, they had originally planned to launch a large-scale offensive on every one of the 13 primary directions, And before that could happen, they were forced to completely overhaul their strategic plans. And part of their forces and resources from the Pokrovsk direction and the Ocheritin direction were actually redeployed to the Oleksandrivka direction.
So our defense forces are now conducting offensive operations in the Oleksandrivka direction? How successful have they been?
The offensive operation? Well, success is actually measured by the liberation of territory. And as of today, that's 480 square kilometers. This exceeds the results we achieved during the Dobrapilya counteroffensive operation. If you remember, during the operation, we liberated over 430 square kilometers of territory.
The Russians heavily promoted, both on their Telegram channels and in various other media they control, their so-called spring offensive. Do you feel it? Is it actually happening? Why did it fail, if it did fail? Or maybe they're just planning to launch it? April, May, there are still 2 months of spring left, right?
Well, to be honest, they actually never really stopped carrying out or attempting to carry out offensive actions. And these offensive actions essentially continued and persisted from the year 2025 into 2026. And we all remember those specific days and moments right before New Year's when the weather conditions got worse, deteriorated, and it was really severe. There was a significant amount of intense activity, a major surge in the enemy's offensive actions. And of course, the Russian command felt the pressure, especially since their strategic plans for the year 2025 were completely disrupted and not fulfilled. And I just want to remind you that they made several aggressive attempts to capture the entirety of Donetsk and Luhansk, the majority of Dnipropetrovsk, the Zaporizhzhia Oblast regions, and create strategic buffer zones in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions, and commence their strategic military operations in the Mykolaiv and Kherson regions. That is to say, these were the overarching global plans. There were a significant number of official announcements made. Do you remember how many announcements there were around the capture? Kupenskaya, back when there were even jokes being made, when they actually presented the medal specifically for the third capture of Kupetsky. How many times did they take Pokrovsky? Honestly, I don't even remember anymore. 6, 7 times? I lost count. I remember this started happening back in September 2024. Back then, at first, they claimed that Pokrovsky would be taken by September 30th. Yet even to this very day, our courageous defenders are still steadfastly holding the line. In the Pokrovsky direction, they're holding the northern outskirts of Pokrovsky and Mirnograd. And every day, the enemy tries to attack. And they keep attacking. Our positions take losses and fall back, leaving nothing but lifeless bodies behind. There are also many wounded survivors, but they haven't had any success in their efforts.
If we're talking about the enemy, where's their weakest spot? Not tactically, like in some specific direction, but systemically? Why can't they achieve their ambitious goals? Well, besides the fact that they're getting their teeth knocked out by the armed forces, well,
first of all, it is because they are simply looters, and because they are fighting on land that is definitely not theirs. They are fighting only with sheer numbers, and certainly not with any quality, because they underestimate their enemy, in other words, us. And their capabilities just aren't enough to accomplish the tasks they set for themselves and their troops. And of course, the resilience of our troops, smart planning, the significant overall impact of those reforms that were successfully implemented across the board, the Corps' reform after Crimea, the high-quality training of our military personnel. It's the skillful deployment and use of weapons. Our highly experienced drone operators and specialized UAV units, mechanized brigades, dedicated brigades, airborne assault troops, and assault units. All of this leads to the enemy suffering losses. They tend to overstate their actual capacity to adequately staff their units and subunits. That's why they constantly deploying soldiers to fill their ranks with individuals who aren't ready for combat, who aren't adequately trained or prepared.
Let's talk about our tactics and strategy. In general, over the past year, if I counted correctly, there were 3 offensive operations. This year, one has already been carried out. You mentioned 480 kilometers of liberated territory. What is our main strategic goal for this year? Is it containment? Is it attrition? Or are we preparing for some new major offensive? Is it even possible to announce something like that?
Our goal, of course, for this year, it's about conducting a defensive operation involving live fire with the goal of containing the enemy, preventing any loss of territory, wearing down their forces and resources, creating conditions for large-scale offensive operations, building up our reserves, providing high-quality training for our service members, and at the same time, carrying out counteroffensive and offensive operations in those areas where the enemy is weak. Driven by the primary objective of liberating occupied territory, and even more significantly, successfully seizing the operational and strategic initiative. Because right now, the enemy is playing by our rules. In other words, they're forced to adapt and focus their efforts where we choose, specifically where we are advancing.
Is it difficult to force the enemy to play by our rules?
It's incredibly difficult. It's the tremendous effort of every single person who was involved, from the common soldier all the way up to the general. Because all offensive operations, of course, require, first of all, extremely detailed and comprehensive planning. Second, thorough and meticulous preparation. And finally, maintaining the absolute strictest secrecy regarding every detail. Because any information leaks lead to all those actions becoming completely unsuccessful.
If we talk about some regarding tasks carried out on the battlefield, as Commander-in-Chief, what was your toughest decision from every perspective? Technical, moral, personal, and professional.
You know, every decision is difficult. Every decision, they don't just come out of nowhere, like boom, you make a decision. No, of course, everything is carefully thought through. Sometimes you have to make decisions based on the situation that develops on the battlefield. It happens that sometimes the enemy succeeds, and then you have to make decisions almost instantly. For that, you need to have reserves, combat-ready reserves. For that, you need to know the capabilities of both your commanders and your military units to carry out one task or another. So let's just say there are no easy decisions. And as you might imagine, there are some incredibly difficult decisions to make here. Really tough ones. For example, I can recall some of those decisions. It is quite likely that the decision was made concerning the Kursk operation.
How difficult was it for you to make that decision, to dare to make it?
Well, you know, it's not so much about daring to do. It's about making the decision. Here, let's say it became absolutely essential to arrive at a shared and mutual understanding.
Among everyone, it was such a
bold, daring operations.
To use the enemy's language so they would get it. So, was it you who took the risk and made such a bold decision? A decision like that? Well,
you know, first of all, it was a calculated risk. First of all, if you remember, the situation at that time was very difficult. We basically had no choice because the enemy was advancing on almost every front. At that time, he significantly, let's say, boosted the motivation of his troops. Back then, the levels of monetary compensation were increased. They completely revised the amounts of financial support. For every category without exception, they set progressive bonuses, again in dollars. In addition, they carried out an extensive and wide-reaching mobilization campaign to recruit diverse segments of the general population, focusing most specifically on former convicts. And I want to say that a very significant portion of the Russian Federation's armed forces is, let's say, composed of these individuals. That.
People from a criminal background?
Yes, exactly, yes. Because last year, there were 96,000 of them in their armed forces. And back during that specific time, we actually went through a long period when we still hadn't completely and fully recovered after. Back in Avdiivka, when the enemy first began their major offensive on Kharkiv, you surely remember that, Kharkiv and Vovchansk, but we managed to get ahead of them there. This was because we reacted in plenty of time and were able to successfully bring up all our strategic reserves that were being carefully prepared for the front line at that exact moment. And in fact, as you might remember, it was only in one specific place that they were actually able to advance 9 kilometers. And in other places it was 5 or 6, and sometimes they didn't advance at all. And basically they got bogged down in the border battles. After that, they regrouped. They had just then, the 44th Corps had just completed its combat coordination, which was supposed to become the core of the group specifically in the Kharkov direction. They, let's say, regrouped their main assets in the Snihirivka direction, and then they began their offensive. And something had to be done. Well, we needed something truly incredible and unexpected to force the enemy to completely abandon their original strategic plans and redeploy their forces and resources to where it was, let's say, highly advantageous and convenient for us to strike and destroy them. And after a very thorough and detailed study of the entire front line, that's when we turned back to the Sumy direction, where the enemy was also planning to carry out an offensive operation. And they even assembled and organized an assault group of approximately 26,000 troops during that specific period. At the same time, they deployed all these forces in the Kharkiv direction, right when they started sustaining significant casualties and managed to achieve some success. This specific direction was actually an absolutely critical top priority for us because we saw that the vast majority of their military forces had been moved and only a single unit remained. It was just a specialized border guard detachment covering the state border. These were battalions that were holding a 12 to 14 kilometer front, and they were mostly composed entirely of young conscripts. Of course, it would have been a mistake not to take advantage of that. Such an opportunity. That's why we took every possible measure to redeploy the aerosol brigades. At first, 2 of them, which had already gone through rotation, and then the 95th. Remember what we did? As a matter of fact, we pulled it right out of the thick of the fighting. We managed to preserve everything completely. It was kept secret. Nobody knew. This operation, that was the first time. Let's put it this way. Assault units were making the combat decisions.
That's an uncomfortable question. There's war and politics. When Putin went to war against Ukraine, he made a political decision. From that, his generals and commanders had to make certain military decisions directly for the military operations. Do these political decisions always align with political expediency? Speaking from our side, if we're talking about it.
As you might already know, all military actions are ultimately rooted in politics. You can't say that a war just starts on its own. Of course, it's a decision made by the military and political leadership. For us, this is a just war, but for them, it's a war for the army's sake, even though they won't admit it.
To say that they underestimated the enemy, that's why they didn't succeed in 2022, and that's why they still can't capture it today. Donetsk region, underestimating the enemy, that's a very dangerous thing. Are we realistically assessing our enemy? How much stronger have they become? Where have they made progress? And what is the greatest danger from them?
Well, you see, war is a constant competition. It's a competition between armed forces and a competition between economies. Technology, so all of this happens together as a whole. It is a simple fact that whoever is more thoroughly prepared, better equipped, and uses more technologically advanced modern weapons is ultimately the one who succeeds. And of course, we absolutely cannot afford to underestimate the strength of our enemy. Doing something like that would be a massive, potentially fatal mistake on our part that we would surely regret. The enemy is strong. It's truly one of the most powerful armies in the world. You can see the numbers, the equipment, the fairly sophisticated weapons, and especially the drones, missile weapons, various strike weapons, again, ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, long-range strike drones, and mines. You can't evaluate it anywhere in a real-world setting.
What is their biggest advantage? Is it only numbers or technologically as well?
Technologically, too, in a number of areas, they surpass us. And that's a fact. They have strong air defense. That's a fact. They have a significant and diverse arsenal of advanced weaponry, ballistic weapons, and cruise missiles. They have a developed air force, strike aviation. Every single day, they carry out between 70 and 90 airstrikes against us. I am specifically referring to their strike aviation. They're also using between 200 and 300 guided aerial bombs on a regular basis. This constant bombardment has become a very serious and difficult problem for our forces to deal with. And so far, let's say, no effective means of countering guided aerial bombs have been found. That's true. It's extremely challenging, again, when you consider both the high cost and the overall volume. Of course, we know how to fight back. First and most importantly, we need to completely neutralize and destroy their means of air attack, primarily their aircraft. The enemy is, indeed, a formidable and highly capable adversary for us.
And especially with all these bombs, missiles, cruise, ballistic, and whatever other surreal types, they have a huge arsenal, and a large number of people in their army. But at the same time, the whole world is studying the microgeography of Donbass because of their offensive actions. So yeah, it's slow progress. Even all the world's media are laughing about it now, saying at this rate, it'll take them 50 years to advance as far as they're planning. So, I mean, why is that? Is it because they're not seeing the success they expected? What's their systemic mistake, maybe?
Their fundamental and systemic mistake is, first of all, as I've already mentioned before, that they consistently underestimate the true capabilities of our troops and the deep-seated strength of our motivation. We have a distinct advantage when it comes to quality training, skill, the effective use of our advanced weaponry, comprehensive strategic planning, and of course, the fact that we truly understand what's at stake. The highest value for us is the precious life of every single soldier. That's what matters most to us. We think things over many times before taking any action. That doesn't mean we drag out the process. No, it all happens very quickly. We listen, then make a decision. I make the decision after hearing everyone out. But our planning is actually based on preserving the lives of our soldiers. And we do everything we can to keep our losses to a minimum, even under conditions where the enemy outnumbers us, in some directions by several times.
Today, there are many of them being carried out. We've seen successful strikes. Leningrad region, Ust-Luga, Primorsk. How successful is Ukraine in carrying out such strikes, such attacks? What do they give us first and foremost? What are the advantages, and how would you assess everything that is happening now on the aggressor's territory, are actions that we are successfully carrying out on the aggressor's territory?
These are highly strategic and impactful actions for us, which are exceptionally successful in their execution and, first of all, effectively diminish their overall capabilities. You know that the main targets are oil facilities. The large-scale extraction of industrial natural gas, which is partially industrial but mainly the massive oil refining facilities, which serve as the primary and most crucial source of the aggressor's vital foreign currency and dollar-denominated revenue.
So they're making $700 million a day from oil?
Naturally, which essentially enables them to finance the ongoing war. Our strikes undermine it. Their military and industrial potential. We are systematically destroying and neutralizing their factories that produce various types of missiles as well as essential ammunition directly. Elements of control systems and, the Vodkinsky plant, as well as a number of other plants like Kremniel, which specifically specialize in advanced control systems for ballistic missiles, and indeed for all types of missiles. This is actually a highly efficient and strategic tool for reducing the offensive potential and, in general, the overall military and industrial potential of the aggressor. It is certainly true that launching successful strikes against such highly sensitive and strategic energy targets as Ust-Luga and Primorsk generally serves to significantly reduce the overall capacity to export oil products, including those specifically managed by the clandestine shadow fleet operations.
What I'd like to ask you is to scale this up. For example, we've accurately hit some targets, strategic ones like Ust-Luga and Primorsk. What does that feel like? For us in the East, how does a soldier in the trench feel about it? How do you feel about it as the commander-in-chief? Is it easier to breathe? Do they have some kind of destabilization? You also monitor their morale within their army, within their units. Is it noticeable, their internal tension in response to the intensity of the situation on our front? Well,
To say directly, let's say, that we hit a target and immediately feel it on the front line, no, there isn't such a direct connection. Of course, all of this happens slowly and indirectly. Currently, there are significant delays with supplies, and there are major disruptions in weapons deliveries. For instance, the tanks didn't arrive and the missiles didn't launch. Furthermore, there's a noticeable reduction in the stockpile of these missiles and a steady decrease in the total number of launches, for example, of those same Shahads, because basically we know the truth. Their original plan was that in 2025, they would produce 404 Shahads every single day. And in their plans for 2026, they intended to produce 1,000 per day. As I understand it, these are just plans. For now, they're unrealistic for them.
they haven't reached that number.
They haven't, that's right. Well, and of course, this limits their capabilities. That means both paying for and increasing, as well as expanding the size of the armed forces, because they're already feeling it in the regions. We know there's a lack of funds, payments to the population are decreasing, there are delays, and monitoring social media shows us there's a lot of dissatisfaction. The dissatisfaction is specifically about the delays in payments. And among the ranks of their active servicemen, this also has a profoundly negative and detrimental effect on the overall morale and psychological state, as well as their individual and collective willingness to carry out assigned combat missions and tactical operations.
Mobilization. We all know that war is first and foremost about people. Someone has to carry and use the weapons. In the end, someone has to shoot it to destroy the enemy. What is lacking the most right now? Is it people, equipment, or some management decisions that are missing? A systematic state has to make some decisions.
Of course, if you ask any commander at the front right now, 2 years ago, it was all about shells and rockets. But now, it's about people, highly trained people, professional and skilled servicemen who are fully prepared and ready to fulfill their military duty. Because mobilization, obviously, is the main source for replenishing the needs of the armed forces. And right here, our main job is to carefully oversee the situation to ensure this entire process happens smoothly and efficiently. You could say, as comfortably as possible for those specific people who are currently mobilizing their troops. That is to say, so there are absolutely no violations, no breaches of the existing law, and no violations whatsoever in the official procedures used during the mobilization process.
How would you rate the mobilization in Ukraine on a scale from 1 to 10? Well, let's see.
You know, I'm afraid I might not be objective. You always want to be. You?
Have every right to do so.
I know, yes. Well, probably around a 6 or 7. Something like that.
Very often.
I wish it were higher.
More people or better quality training? What would you like to see more of to give a higher rating?
I would really like to see a much higher standard of comprehensive and professional training. And I want to have more highly motivated and dedicated personnel who remain committed to staying with their specific military unit, but who also consistently and effectively carry out every single one of their assigned duties and mission tasks.
Often, when people talk about motivation, they talk about fairness. The main excuse of those who aren't very motivated is that they say the mobilization is unfair. Different approaches are being proposed in society, different approaches. What specific type of mobilization would you deem to be fair and equitable?
You know, that's a very complicated concept. Fairness in what sense? Of course, it's fair when all citizens have to fulfill some kind of duty. There is absolutely no clear distinction between those who are eligible for the mandatory mobilization and those who aren't, despite the fact that they currently have every reason to be mobilized. That's precisely where fairness should be, at least when looking at it from my own perspective.
What'd you say to those who are trying to avoid military service today? How would you address them? What would you say to them, first of all?
To begin with, it is important to remember that we are all citizens of our country, and we must honor and fulfill our solemn civic responsibilities. And now, at this moment, when the hostile aggressor is actively advancing against us, we have to do our duty. We have to stand firm to defend our entire nation, protect our children, and safeguard all our loved ones and relatives. That is, I honestly have no idea how they'll look each other in the eye once this war is over, or how they will look their own children in the eye. Probably, this is more of a moral issue. It's not just about having the motivation to fight, but also about understanding your duty, that these aren't just empty words. We're all fighting.
There's another very unpleasant thing I'd still like to talk about. Some people are leaving the military units where they serve without permission. AWOL, this is also a relevant issue in Ukrainian society, unfortunately. But war isn't black and white. It has many aspects, and AWOL is one of them. What is being done to bring these deserters back? Should it be stricter, punishment, or some kind of additional incentive? What's your view on this problem, and how do you think it should be solved?
Actually, a significant amount has been done to actively encourage and support service members who, for various reasons, left their military units, that is, were officially classified as AWOL, to finally return. All the necessary conditions have been created, and every day, many of our service members return to the reserve battalions, where they are assigned either to their own units or to other units. Punishment? Well, you know, it's only...
Is stricter punishment actually effective, based on your experience? You're in charge, right?
Strict. You know, I'm not a disciplinarian. In my opinion, there are already enough tough measures in place, and the command is already strict enough with everyone who breaks the law. Here, let's explain it in this particular way. I personally view the entire process as creating the right conditions so that there are the smallest possible number of AWOL cases at every single stage of mobilization.
What else can be done about this? What
else can be done? First of all, make the conditions of mobilization themselves more, well, as I already said, maybe the word comfortable isn't quite right. But we fully recognize and understand that the primary underlying reason people go AWOL isn't because they don't want to serve, but because they're genuinely terrified for their own personal safety, which is, of course, perfectly natural. So the process, in order to, let's say when someone's life changes drastically, when a person ends up at the territorial recruitment center and then at a training center for preparation, that this process happens as painlessly as possible. So that at each and every single stage, all the personnel working directly with the mobilized, specifically referring to the staff at the territorial recruitment and staffing centers, they carried out their responsibilities and treated every one of these individuals with true humanity, with a full understanding of the profound significance of that specific word. That is to say, so there would be no insults or cold formalism, and so they wouldn't view them with a cold gaze as if they were already... Well, you know how it is. Everyone wants to be treated like a human being. This kind of humane attitude should be present at every stage. Then, I think there will be far fewer problems. And of course, proper conditions have been created. We're doing this. We're constantly trying. Both the President of Ukraine, the Minister of Defense, and the Armed Forces Command. We're doing our best to create proper conditions. This principle actually applies to the aspects of both accommodation and safety, because at the training centers, every one of us must go underground. We're setting up decent living and everyday conditions down there underground. We have, for instance, we could say that it significantly decreased the number of problems related to food. And the entire training process itself fully meets every single one of the rigorous requirements for modern battlefield preparation. All the various challenges and complexities that exist there are addressed. We now know for a fact that the total number of training days at these specialized training centers has been officially increased to 50 days. An additional 14-day adaptive training course has been introduced. In other words, everything has been done so that a person who ends up...
This comfortable transition from civilian to military life.
Yes, and so that people consciously just understand that they need to prepare for war. Actually, that whole intensive training process itself, it really was a complex two-way street for everyone involved. So it's not just the instructor who demands and teaches, but also that the trainees themselves get as much as possible out of what they're being given. Because they just need to understand that their lives and health depend on the quality of their training and how well they absorb the material. And then right after, when this entire process of conscious learning and preparation really becomes, how should I put it, perfect, I think the number of unauthorized absences from units will decrease significantly, and of course within the units themselves. You have to constantly communicate with people. I visit the units, I talk to everyone.
That word is still being thrown around. The one that personally makes me cringe now, reforms. At first, our international partners demanded, NATO demanded, that Ukraine reform its army. Today, it's the Ukrainian army that's reforming NATO. We can see that. So, what needs to change in the army today? What other reforms would you add on that?
As for when it comes to the topic of reforms, well, we're currently carrying out a very significant and comprehensive reform. We haven't finished it yet, but it's the corps level reform.
What's involved? Since many still don't get this corps reform, where does it stand now?
As you might already know, it's at the second stage now. So the reform is about the fact that in the first stage, the various corps headquarters were officially established. So at that time, we already had 3 corps. At that point, 16 corps had been formed. So basically, 13 in the armed forces and 2 more corps in the National Guard. The Guard, yeah. And as we speak here today, the development and creation of these core sets is still actively continuing to move forward. So what exactly was the reform about? The core issue centered on the fact that there was a massive standing army, but a significant lack of professional military command bodies, especially at the operational level. And back then, if you recall correctly, we had these operational tactical groups, which were specialized commands that were formed using various regional headquarters, specifically the headquarters of operational commands, and often various military educational institutions, as well as those very same territorial recruitment and social support centers. So the individuals and personnel in these operational tactical groups were there on a strictly temporary and provisional basis, in temporary positions, specifically assigned and deployed for a certain period, like a duration of roughly 2 or even 3 months. That's it. And this really affected the quality of command. They didn't know their troops, the ones they were commanding, and didn't feel a sense of responsibility. And it was extremely challenging, by the way, to even inquire regarding this responsibility because the individuals involved weren't in constant contact or in a state of direct subordination. Everything was temporary. That's the first thing. Secondly, the number of command units clearly didn't match the number of brigades. So the number of combat brigades increased. And this process was objective because the enemy was also increasing their numbers. If you recall, they actually started this aggression with about 140,000 troops, and now that number has grown significantly to 718,000. Of course, the number of our armed forces and combat units was also growing. That's it. But the number of command and control bodies basically stayed the same, because there just weren't any more of them, and there was no one to create new ones from. So the command system was overloaded. I remember that some operational tactical groups were commanding 20 to 23 brigades. So the process itself was extremely complicated, difficult, and inefficient. That's why the decision was made to create and transition to a corps system. So we calculated the number of corps in order to relieve and optimize the command system as much as possible, first and foremost. And when people say that entire corps formations or command structures don't actually command their brigades, well, of course, in the middle of a major wartime conflict, during active combat, you can't just take and subordinate brigades directly to corps, because after the war finally ends, there will be a comprehensive reorganization and a total restructuring of the command system. That means some brigades will be assigned to certain corps or to others, and all of this will depend on the locations, the actual permanent physical deployment sites, I mean, the corps themselves, yeah. So in any case, that system will be reviewed specifically with the goal of optimization. That's it, and the main task is to lighten the command structure, which is exactly what happened. And right now, we're in the second stage, where we might be relocating brigades that have their own specifics. For example, National Guard brigades, right? The First Corps is already fully formed and commands its own brigades now. The Third Army Corps, for example, has its own complete set of brigades. And in other corps, where it's possible, we're relocating brigades. At the same time, just to say it like that, either subordinate them and make it so, like, if he has his own brigades, then let him command them, and they'll be his. Well, that doesn't really work either, because in the Corps, there are also territorial defense brigades and brigades that, for example, belong to the Marines, and airborne assault brigades and assault units. And all these different brigades, they are constantly moving around the battlefield because some have lost their combat capability and have been withdrawn, while another brigade is brought in to take over their position, and other brigades are transferred to the offensive group. So this whole process, that's right, it's like a dynamic and living organism that is constantly breathing, constantly moving, and constantly actively maneuvering and engaging in combat. So having a stable position like that, well, at this point in time, it's simply and completely impossible for them to establish. And regarding the second stage, what's happening with us? We're finishing the formation of corps-level units. That is, in order to conduct corps-level operations, you need to have a full set of troops. Well, for example, there have been battalions of unmanned systems created. Now, in a number of corps where these battalions have already been established, they're being turned into regiments. A unit for aerodetronic warfare has been created. So, in fact, artillery brigades and anti-aircraft missile battalions have been established in almost all corps. There are also engineering units and support units. In other words, everything that each corps needs to be able to carry out a full-scale operation. So we're actually at the final stage of this process right now.
And there will be a third stage.
Now, looking ahead, the third stage will most likely occur during the time when we leave everything exactly the way they are right now, and it is highly probable that the third stage will unfold gradually as the fighting finally comes to an end.
What are these new assault troops? There are all sorts of discussions like this going around on social media. People are saying Syrskyi wants to destroy the air assault forces, and that he came up with these new assault troops for that purpose. Why are they being created? Who are they? Are they going to duplicate or complement existing forces? So can the paratroopers breathe easy, knowing everything will be fine for them, just like it always has been?
You know, as they often say, there are ancient myths and there are timeless legends, right? These legends and stories that have been passed down through the generations. So, you know, assault troops have actually existed for 1.5 years already. They demonstrated and solidified their capability and effectiveness during the Kursk operation, and actually even before that. But officially, let's say, the first traditions, the combat traditions, and the long-standing combat history were actually established during the Kursk operation, where 2 assault battalions successfully broke through and penetrated the enemy's defenses, overcame their front line, and the complex system of defensive lines and positions that had been created. By the way, they were exceptionally well prepared and fortified, even though, let's say, there weren't enough enemy troops stationed there. That's it. And after that, once they clearly demonstrated their overall effectiveness, their impressive mobility and versatility, and their unique ability to act quickly, of course, we started to scale up this experience and significantly increase the numbers. This was because specialized assault troops are now absolutely needed at the front. You know, every single corps commander simply can't imagine successful operations in modern combat without them. So, these assault troops are essential. How are they different from airborne assault troops? Airborne assault troops, you see, are RLE. These are specialized brigades equipped with heavy weaponry, featuring the most modern and sophisticated arms available in our armed forces today. They undergo rigorous training and are used for various critical operations, whether it's offense, defense, or other types of combat. And right now, they form the essential backbone of our offensive groups. In order for them to be able to carry out their duties, well, of course, certain conditions need to be created for them. So, you know, back in 2022, right after the Kyiv operation concluded, when we successfully liberated the city of Kyiv, the surrounding Kyiv region, and actually all of northern Ukraine, the situation in the east escalated significantly. Consequently, I was then transferred over to Khortytsia to serve as the commander of the Khortytsia Operational Strategic Group of Troops. When I arrived, there wasn't a single reserve, not even a single battalion in reserve. We started creating reserves. Immediately following these events, my staff and I began conducting a thorough analysis of the entire situation, specifically what could be done and how we could effectively shift the momentum and course of this war in our favor. That is to say, it became clear that taking decisive offensive actions was absolutely necessary. But with what forces? It was quite obvious that we were in desperate need of airborne assault brigades, which during that specific period were the most prepared and combat-ready units in the armed forces. We started looking for these brigades, but in those brigades, only 1 or 2 battalions remained. So there was a brigade, but it had only 1 or 2 airborne assault battalions, while the other battalions were territorial defense or mechanized battalions. Why exactly did this happen? Well, it's because since they were the most highly trained and the front line is always, let's say, moving or retreating, of course, to effectively stop the enemy, they would always use the most well-prepared unit available. Who did they use? Well, of course, the paratroopers, and it turned out that all the airborne brigades ended up without their own battalions. That is, there was a battalion here, a battalion there, another one over there, and so on. And back when we were carefully preparing the Kharkiv offensive operation, I actually had to bring all those battalions back. I had to carry out a whole series of very complicated operations just to swap one battalion here and then another one there in a completely different direction. Then I had to swap them again, pull this specific airborne battalion out, and make absolutely sure they were ready. Why is that? Because there simply just weren't any other units available that could replace them. Right now, these functions are being carried out by assault troops, assault units, assault regiments, assault battalions. So assault troops are meant to operate outside the main lines. They usually don't have their own designated sectors. They're used across the entire sector and, well, along the whole front line, engaging in combat all along the line of contact there. Music, it's necessary to stabilize the situation where positions have been abandoned, where quick or short-term offensive actions are needed to strike, and most importantly, to support the actions of the main offensive group. So the tasks of the airborne assault troops and the assault units and subunits don't overlap with each other in any way. On the contrary, they actually fight together. They complement one another perfectly. As a general rule, field commanders and paratroopers always request an assault unit to support their actions, whether it's to carry out these operations, cover the flanks, perform flanking maneuvers, or strike and then lead the airborne assault brigade. So this is a vital and immediate necessity. It's a defining characteristic of this modern conflict. It's a fundamental and defining characteristic, just like cyber forces, because in this day and age, you really can't imagine fighting without them, without breaking into cyberspace, without having data, and without the ability to effectively disrupt or block some of the enemy's command networks. So let's just say, this is exactly the kind of war we're fighting. And these are the lessons of this war.
Technologically speaking, what are the priorities today if we're talking about making the military more high-tech? What are the current priorities for the Ukrainian military? Where did drones and artificial intelligence rank in all this? What else still needs to be implemented? And what have we already successfully put into practice?
Well, of course, you're absolutely right. Like I pointed out at the very start of our discussion today, war is not simply a clash between two armies. It's also a competition of technologies and the capabilities of states. So the primary mission we face, since the enemy significantly outnumbers us, is to effectively offset their numerical advantage with the high level of advanced technological equipment in our units. Of course, drones now completely dominate the modern battlefield. They are currently evolving at an incredibly rapid and unprecedented pace. They have proven their effectiveness. And now the whole world, since we are basically pioneers in the use of these drones and their application, has seen that our experience is needed everywhere, and right now in the Middle East. So, of course, making the army more technologically advanced is our main priority. What does that mean? It means taking every possible measure and making every effort to increase the number of robotic platforms, both on the ground and in the air, meaning UAVs, of a wide variety of different specialized types, to replace humans as much as possible, so that, once again, we can protect and preserve the precious lives of our brave soldiers. And at this very moment, we are actually in what is probably the most demanding and critical stage of this entire process, because all of our reforms, restructuring, and the modernization of our national armed forces is fundamentally linked to the process of equipping them with drones. We're introducing new units in every single brigade. we have now established a dedicated battalion of unmanned systems. In our standard battalions, our frontline battalions, we have companies, short pause, specifically for unmanned systems. In our brigades, according to this new organizational structure, short pause, we also have specialized drone interceptors. These are the ones that, let's say, cover our infantry and intercept enemy drones. We have strike drones, the ones that destroy the enemy. And this is, basically a kind of weapon that complements our heavy bombers. Where do we have an advantage over the enemy? In every single battalion and in every brigade, we have now successfully set up specialized units of ground robotic systems. And right now, we can't even imagine, effectively using, deploying, or providing complex logistics, or even evacuating the wounded without them, because that is exactly what these advanced drones are designed for. We've already taken significant steps forward and have had very successful and positive experiences using these specialized aerial transport platforms for evacuating the wounded. We use lightweight and agile, once again, unmanned aircraft to provide essential logistical support in those specific areas where our units are actively pushing forward or steadfastly holding their defensive lines. So, in specific regions that are completely saturated with drones and under the control of enemy strike drones, it is important to note that the expansion of kill zones is also a characteristic feature, and it's precisely here that drones are used to provide logistics. And artificial intelligence, of course, is also being used because it's being applied in all directions, branches, and types of the armed forces. Robotics, first and foremost, and artificial intelligence. These are guidance systems, targeting systems, control systems for unmanned aerial vehicles, especially interceptors, that automatically lock onto a target and destroy it. These are sophisticated anti-aircraft defense systems, again, that completely on their own, without manual intervention, will lock onto, track, and destroy any incoming threats detected in the sky. And of course, in headquarters, we're already using artificial intelligence as well. And we've created a special unit that studies the specifics of using it, because there are a lot of advantages, but there are also certain risks, right? In terms of protecting information, preventing leaks, and so on. That's it. So technological advancement is the primary direction we are heading in right now. At the same time, we are also actively reforming the entire territorial defense system, focusing primarily on the structure of the brigades. This involves a careful reorganization, especially given the unique specifics of how these particular brigades are currently staffed, which is mainly with dedicated service members who are 50 years of age and older. Understanding that these units also play a very significant and vital role in defending key positions in secondary directions, we have decided that the total number of active battalions within these brigades is being reduced down to 3 to ensure better efficiency and management. But 2 battalions of unmanned systems are being introduced. And these battalions are standard battalions, just like those in regular mechanized brigades or airborne assault brigades. So units are being introduced, artillery units, including a 152mm artillery battery, an anti-aircraft missile battery, ground robotic systems units, and other support units. In other words, the brigade is increasing its combat capabilities 3-fold. So moving forward in this specific direction as well, thanks to advanced technological innovations and steadily expanding our fleet of unmanned aerial vehicles, we are substantially enhancing and strengthening our overall combat capabilities.
Well, I can't finish this interview without asking one more question. It's actually a very short one. I want to ask for your vision, your idea of victory. What should it look like? When will you, Oleksandr Syrskyi, be able to say, that's it, I can put a period here, and, go on vacation with my family? The war's over. What does victory look like from your point of view?
When the enemy is defeated and we accomplish all the tasks we've set for ourselves. When peace is concluded on our terms, a just peace, we will not lose our territory, at least not yet. So, we will then be able to say that, yes, indeed, at this stage, we have accomplished our tasks. We didn't leave a single meter of our land. We have inflicted such losses on the enemy and created such conditions that they can't dictate their terms to us. And this peace will be concluded on our terms. Well, at the very least, yes,